This is lecture recording for the integumentary system, or the skin. The hypodermis is a structure that lies underneath the skin, and oftentimes is talked about in conjunction with the skin. But technically speaking, it's not part of the skin. The skin can be divided into two layers. The most superficial layer is the epidermis. Lying deep to that is the dermis layer. Different regions of our body have skin with varying thickness. For overall, all of our skin accounts for approximately 7% of our body weight, and it's the largest organ of our body. Lying deep to the dermis layer is the hypodermis, and it's composed mostly of areolar tissue and adipose tissue. So once again, it's not considered part of skin, but because of its proximity to the skin, it's oftentimes talked about in conjunction with the skin. And later in this lecture, we'll also discuss some of the skin appendages, including the different types of glands, the sweat gland, oil glands, as well as structures like the nail and the hair. Now, this is just a beautiful image illustrating the histology of the skin as well as the underlying hypodermis. And we'll talk about some of these details later in this lecture. Now, the skin and the hypodermis have some important roles. One of the primary roles of the skin is it helps shield our body away from external damage. So it protects the underlying organs, whether it's from ultraviolet radiation, from chemicals, from excessive heat loss or water loss. It also helps provide cushioning for underlying organs. Secondarily, it provides a method for our body to regulate its temperature. Okay. And that's done through the help of capillary networks as well as sweat glands. So the reason why on a hot day you're sweating is because your body is trying to get rid of that excess heat. Okay. And similarly, on a hot day, the tiny blood vessels going to your skin will dilate, and that allows more heat to be lost. Okay. And it prevents your body from overheating. Your skin also provides as a way for your body to get rid of metabolic waste such as urea. Okay. And that's done through sweating. Okay. Your skin is also the site of vitamin D activation. Epidermal cells are able to utilize the UV radiation to activate the vitamin D. Finally, the skin is the site of sensory reception. It contains a range and a variety of different sensory organs that allows you to detect different types of sensations. So the receptors that are responsible for sensing deep pressure versus something that's a light touch versus something that's painful, okay, those are all done by these different types of sensory receptors. So this image is real dissection of skin, showing the most superficial being the epidermis, and then the dermis underneath that, followed by the hypodermis, Underneath that is a deep fascia before we get to the muscle. When we take a closer look at the epidermis, we can further divide that layer of stratified squamous epithelium into 5 sublayers. The most superficial layer of that is the stratum corneum. And underneath that is the stratum lucidum, then stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. Stratum basale has another name. It's known as the stratum germinativum. Underneath all these 5 layers of dermis, we have the dermis. The dermis can be further subdivided into 2 layers. The papillary layer, or the papillary dermis, which is made up of mostly areolar connective tissue, and then the reticular dermis, which is made up of mostly dense irregular connective tissue. Finally, underneath those 2 layers, we have the hypodermis. Okay. And because this layer consists of a lot of fat, so oftentimes you would also hear the term subcutaneous fat, okay, or subcutaneous layer. Okay. So epidermis, dermis. If you zoom in, you'll see the papillary layer is relatively thin compared to the reticular layer of dermis. Underneath those 2 are the hypodermis, is the hypodermis. Okay. Once again, your skin is made up of a type of tissue making up the epidermis. Is the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Here's a mnemonic to help you remember the 5 layers of epidermis. Californians like girls in string bikinis. So starting from the most superficial layer with the stratum corneum. G for granulosum. Okay. S for spinosum. B for basale. And the stratum lucidum, represented by the L here. This layer is a very thin layer that's only present on thick skin. So there are only certain regions of our body where thick skin can be found. Okay. And the thick skin are found in places that are hairless. So the skin of your palm, as well as the skin of your soles, your bottom of your feet, as well as your palms. So those are the 2 primary places where you'll find thick skin. So in those places, you would also find this additional layer called the stratum lucidum. This is another look at those 5 layers. I'm sorry, this is actually showing thin skin, so it's not showing you the stratum lucidum as a result. Now, one major way you can tell this is thin skin as opposed to thick skin is by looking at the stratum corneum. Generally speaking, the stratum corneum in thin skin is much thinner. Contrast this with thick skin. You see the stratum corneum is really thick. So let's take another look at the thin skin. We're going to begin by taking a look at the deepest layer of epidermis. This is the stratum basale. This is the region where we find actively dividing mitotic stem cells. These are the cells that eventually give rise to the cells in more superficial layers. So as the mitotic stem cells here begin to divide, they also begin to differentiate, to specialize, and they move away from this layer. Okay, so they move superficially outward. Okay. And as these cells grow and divide, they are pushed toward the surface. This is also where you'll find some occasional melanocytes and dendritic cells. The melanocytes are cells that are capable of making the pigment called the melanin. Melanin is an important pigment in determining our skin color. Whereas the dendritic cells are macrophage-like cells that are part of our skin's immune system. So here we see the melanocytes making melanin. And then we have the dendritic cells. Moving more superficially, we have the stratum spinosum. This layer is made up of a few layers of keratinocytes that are joined by these structures known as desmosomes. Desmosomes are they are a type of intercellular junction that connect neighboring cells with one another. You can see them as tiny little lines here. And their function is to prevent these cells from being torn apart when the skin is undergoing shearing stress. Moving further outward, we have the stratum granulosum. This is made up of gradually flattening keratinocytes. Here, the keratinocytes have organelles that are beginning to deteriorate. And we begin to see its cytoplasm being filled with granules. And the reason why they are beginning to deteriorate is because the epidermis, the skin tissue, okay, our epidermis is not able to receive its own blood supply. Blood vessels can only reach as far as the dermis. Okay, it cannot penetrate into the epidermis. And so for that reason, the farther away from the base, okay, from the basement membrane, the harder it is for these cells to obtain nutrients and oxygen. Okay, and so the farther away you get from the basement membrane, these cells will begin to die. By the time we get to stratum corneum, the most superficial layer, all that's left are 20 to 30 layers of dead cells. So these cells are too far away from the blood vessels. But they still have an important function because remember keratinocytes, they secrete keratin. Okay, and keratin is a type of protein. So what's left here are the keratin that's secreted by those keratinocytes, and they still serve an important protective role. They prevent water loss on the surface of our skin. Let's take a look at the thick skin. This is very similar to thin skin. From here and above, this is epidermis. These structures are known as dermal papilla. They are the part of the dermis that interdigitate with the epidermis. This is where you will find the areolar connective tissue. So this is the papillary dermis that's made up of mostly areolar connective tissue. Underneath that, the reticular dermis is made up of mostly dense irregular connective tissue, as you can see here. Okay. These are the collagen fibers that we know make up much of the dense irregular connective tissue. So here are some characteristics that differentiate thick skin from thin skin. So despite having a thicker stratum corneum, thick skin actually has a thinner dermis than thin skin. In these places of thick skin, you would also not find hair, oil glands, sebaceous glands, or apocrine sweat glands. So this is another reason why you find your hands get dry, right? It's not able to secrete those oil. This is just a histology image illustrating thick skin, so you can go over this on your own. Now we're going to take a closer look at dermis. Dermis can be subdivided into the papillary dermis. It may not be immediately obvious, but this is where you'll find that areolar connective tissue. And then more obvious is the fact that the reticular layer of dermis is made up of mostly dense irregular connective tissue, as apparent with the collagen fibers running in different directions here. And if you contrast the thickness of the two, you'll notice that the reticular dermis is much thicker than the papillary dermis. Here's yet another image that you can take a look at on your own. Okay. You can see this is an example of thin skin because you can visualize the hair follicle. So if it's got hair, then it's not thick skin. Instead, it's thin skin. Right? Because we know that thick skin don't have hair, they don't have sebaceous glands, they also don't have apocrine glands. Here's the erector pili muscle that's helps our skin produce goosebumps. They tug on that hair follicle and produce a goosebump. The dermal papilla, those structures that interdigitate with the epidermis, they allow an increase of surface area that allows for exchange of gas, nutrients, as well as waste. I won't go over the specifics about epidermal ridges here because you don't have to worry about that. But what you should be aware of that these epidermal ridges or friction ridges, they create the fingerprints. Okay. And they also have the important function of helping to increase the gripping ability of our hands and our feet. If you zoom in microscopically, you'll see tiny little pores. Those are the opening for the sweat glands. The reticular dermis is a much thicker layer of dermis compared to the papillary dermis. It's made of mostly dense irregular connective tissue. It contains flexure lines that create these deep creases in the palms and the soles of our hands and our feet. It's got a rich nerve supply as well as blood supply. And a blood supply is important in our body's regulation of temperature. The hypodermis lies deep to the dermis layer. It's also known as superficial fascia or subcutaneous fat. Contains mostly areolar connective tissue and adipose connective tissue. It helps with energy storage because fat is a form of energy, of fuel. It also has the function of insulating our body. This layer demonstrates a different distribution in male versus in female. Now let's take a look at skin color. The skin color is determined by 3 major pigments in our body. Melanin is the most important one in determining our skin color. It's made up of this amino acid known as tyrosine. Carotene is a yellowish pigment that can be found in plants like carrots and tomatoes. So if you eat a lot of carrots, you can see your skin kind of yellows and changes its color. Hemoglobin is a protein found mostly in our red blood cells. Okay, it gives our red blood cells that red color. Okay, and so it also contributes in a minor part to our skin color. So in Caucasian skin, they contain little melanin. This is where those crimson color of the blood will show through. Let's take a look at the skin appendages. First, we look at the nails. The nail is considered a scale-like modification of the epidermis. What it is it's just a hard keratin. So remember that hard keratin, the keratin that's secreted by keratinocytes? So this is also keratin. And here you can look at the anatomy of a typical nail. So please go over this on your own. Okay, so in the nail matrix, this is where the nail begins to grow. It grows outward, like this. Okay. Now the hair and the hair follicles. The hair follicle is this structure that extend all the way from epidermis into the dermis. It's from this structure that hair grows from. All that hair is just dead keratinized cells, okay, that grow from the hair follicles. The hair can be divided into the shaft and the root. And deep here, where all of it originates from, this is the hair bulb. The erector pili muscle is attached to the hair follicle. It's a smooth muscle, so that means you cannot voluntarily contract it. Its contraction helps pull and erect your hair. Sebaceous glands are the glands that secrete the sebum. Sebum is an oily substance that softens and lubricates our hair and our skin. Okay, so these are the oil glands. It can be found all over our body except for the thick skin, except for places with thick skin, like the palms and the soles. And most of the sebaceous glands are found associated with a hair follicle. So you'll see them extending directly from the hair follicle, and they have this whitish look. Okay, you can see these cells are filled with the oily substance called the sebum. Now, if you take a look at the sweat gland, actually there are two types of sweat gland. The eccrine gland is the one we're going to be more concerned about in this class. So, because this is the most numerous type of sweat glands in our body. The apocrine glands exist in more minor amounts. And these are special glands that are only found in regions like the axilla, so your armpits, around the anus and genital areas. And apocrine gland, they produce a special kind of sweat, and they become more activated at puberty. That's why those teenagers, adolescents, have that stronger body odor. But the eccrine gland produce the true sweat that begin to function, throughout the life, not just at puberty. So this is the most predominant and most numerous type of sweat glands. These eccrine glands are the ones that you have to know the appearance of for this class. They have a tubular structure, sort of a tortuous look to it. These tubes that wrap around one another. Okay. Oh, sorry, wrap around itself. So contrast the appearance of this to the sebaceous gland. This typically has a darker color, and you can see its structure. Okay, it's also very different from that of a sebaceous gland. And finally, eccrine gland typically empties directly onto the surface of the skin as opposed to through the hair follicle, okay, which is the case for sebaceous glands. So sebaceous glands empty through the hair follicles, whereas eccrine glands mostly empty directly to the skin, to the surface of the skin. Okay, that's all for this lecture.